So, this is in some ways a much shorter presentation, partially because we have now filled in some of these sort of broader points, deeper history, but also this third teaching being titled Ireland and the Death of the Left is obviously by necessity a very sort of open-ended sort of obscure topic. It's unclear what the relationship between the two is. It's also and this becomes increasingly apparent throughout the the 20th century. And also you have the proliferation of sort of particularly in Britain, obviously, of Trotskyisms, but the sort of proliferation more broadly in sort of disintegration of the left, the slight variations of different perspectives and so on, which becomes in a sense impossible to sort of catalogue anyway. So we'll just sort of zoom briefly through the sort of partly for time constraints, we'll just sort of shoot through the very broad strokes and then sort of discuss it. So, obviously the title, my poster hasn't disappeared on me. Anyway, the title of this third one is obviously Ireland and the Death of the Left, and the time is of course 1923, only to the present. So, as I think I mentioned at the end of my last presentation, 23 is the end of the Civil War. And there are essentially, there's this split in Sinn Féin, if you will, between pro-treaty Sinn Féin and anti-treaty Sinn Féin. And, pro-treaty Sinn Féin sort of morphs into, obviously they win the Civil War, they morph into, initially the party is Common na Gael, and eventually in 1933 through a merger with various other organisations, the Blue Shirts, sort of quasi-fascist, a bit more than quasi, fascist sort of militia, and a couple of other sort of organisations into what becomes Fine Gael, which is one of the sort of two main established Irish parties. They become law and order sort of upholding excuse me, sort of more pro-business in a sense. In the 1980s, they sort of become often analogized to Thatcherites. So that's sort of one thing I should actually, before I started on this, I should say that the Irish question and Ireland and the left obviously post-partition mainly focuses on the question of Northern Ireland and the border. But part of it's important though to bear in mind, and this is particularly important in relation to the death of the left, is that to actually sort of grasp this problem, what sort of happens, how this politics are sort of moving, you really have to bear in mind both what happens in Northern Ireland, which has its own sort of political landscape, what happens in Southern Ireland, or what becomes the Republic, with its own largely sort of different sort of political landscape that are sort of interrelated, and then obviously in a sort of slightly broader sense what happens then in the UK as a whole. And particularly with the death of the left, this becomes particularly sort of problematic to sort of grasp, with its sort of it's like distinct. The fact that there's like no like political sort of relevance, or even in the sense almost political existence, in any meaningful sense. It's not engaged in politics in any meaningful way. That it sort of becomes increasingly hard for the left, I think, to like even grapple with the sort of like basics of the problem. Partially for this reason. So for that reason, we're simply going to presume, in a sense, 20th century like British politics, Labour and Conservatives. I'm going to presume that, and simply sort of lay out briefly, politics in Southern Ireland, or the Republic as it is now, and then sort of move back around to the question of Northern Ireland. So we left off then with Fine Gael as the sort of one of our two main parties in the Republic, emerging from either the basic divide in Irish politics is around the Civil War. So they emerge from the sort of pro-treaty Sinn Féin. And then after the sort of Civil War, there is a split in anti-treaty Sinn Féin into, and the sort of, the IRA, which was the sort of, the old IRA, it's sometimes called, is the sort of like military wing of like this like Irish state that was like proclaimed in 1916 and then fought for in like the War of Independence. So you have, the split is essentially over whether to participate or not in the sort of like politics of the sort of partitionist states, as they sort of call them. Whether to, having been defeated, to like enter politics, or whether to simply withdraw, essentially, on the basis that both politics in Northern Ireland and the Republic are both illegitimate. So those who sort of, while being opposed to the treaty, but who do then enter politics in the Republic of Ireland, then are led by, I mentioned before, Eamon de Valera, who then founds a new political party called Fianna Fáil, who then are the sort of second of the two like main parties in the Republic. They very quickly become the sort of largest party within, I think, 6 years of being founded, and they remain actually the largest party in the Irish Parliament in the Dáil from 1932 until 2011, and sort of govern in like long sort of 18, 17, 14 year stints. And it's under sort of de Valera that in 1937 that the present sort of constitution of Ireland is adopted, which in many ways is sort of so if it's like official, it's officially it removes all sort of links to like Britain or the Commonwealth. It lays sort of like territorial claim to Northern Ireland. It's a very sort of like socially conservative document. It sort of recognises the like the special place of the Catholic Church, and this is the sort of Fianna Fáil really sort of like dominate politics in the Republic up until very recently. So in the interest of time, so in Northern Ireland then, you have the emergence of, obviously there is a sort of a Protestant majority who then, predominantly Unionist, who then formed the Ulster Unionist Party, which sort of like essentially controls the sort of the state, to use the language that they often use rather than things like stateless, which I think is the CPGB's preferred term. But anyway, to simply run with state. They and they engage in a sort of because they believe the sort of like Catholics are essentially they're afraid they will like subvert the sort of state, subvert the state, and so they engage in sort of forms of discrimination. They sort of like gerrymander electoral districts and sort of discrimination in terms of housing and employment and so on, as a means of sort of remaining like perpetually in power, and this sort of persists then up until the 1960s. In 1967, you have the establishment of what's the Civil Rights Association, based taking inspiration from the sort of civil rights movement in the United States, which campaigns obviously for the end to discrimination, and sort of particularly picks up, particularly in like 1968 with a lot of demonstrations and so on. But there is a lot of like pushback from the sort of unionist majority, both officially through the sort of the state and through like the police, and then unofficially through sort of more sort of like vigilante-esque attacks on like demonstrations and so on. And then in what are called like the Troubles, start then in 1969, officially, with the deployment of the army, because the disorder between nationalists and unionists had grown to such an extent that it was necessary to intervene. And what was interesting was that initially both sides believed that the sort of the British Army was there, i.e. the sort of like representative of like the central state, I suppose, as opposed to the local sort of Northern Ireland state, was there to like protect both. Both believed that it was there to like protect them from the other. And you also have this like Sinn Féin, who persist then into the and the IRA, which persists then into the 1960s. Those who don't sort of fall into engaging in like politics, north or south. There's a split between the beginning in like 67, 68, between what is then becomes like the official IRA, which has become like quite influenced by a sort of Stalinist sort of Marxism, and what then becomes known as the Provisional IRA and Provisional Sinn Féin. Excuse me. And it is they who sort of then become the sort of like main, one of the main sort of like protagonists in like the Troubles. You have the Provisional IRA, you have what then become known as, use the sort of jargon, you have this distinction between what they call like the two moderate categories they use are like, broader catch-all terms are like nationalists and unionists, and the words they use then to refer to extremes who like kill people are Republicans and loyalists. So you have the Provisional IRA, who are Republicans, and then the emergence of, the sort of emergence in the sense of a sort of the UVF in a certain form, obviously very different to the derived in a sense from the earlier UVF, but a very different type of organisation. And the largest of those being the loyalist organisations, being the UDA, the Ulster Defence Association, and then of course you have like the state in these like three sort of like parties. So you have the start then of this like violent conflict in 1969, and it sort of morphs, sort of through 1969 through 1972. You have what sort of the army calls like insurgency, i.e. this like more like sort of serious sort of like high intensity sort of level of like violence, and particularly from the perspective of excuse me, the IRA, the Provisional IRA, who split with the officials over, in the particular case, over whether or not to fight back against sort of loyalist violence, more broadly over the sort of the sort of political sort of question as to what the way forward was. The official IRA wanted to if you will, like engage with politics in a way and sort of attempt to sort of in this like Marxist form to like overcome the sort of like sectarian like divide, and you build a politics towards ultimately I suppose in their conception towards national liberation and revolution, and then you have the sort of like provisional Sinn Féin who sort of prosecute this like aggressive sort of campaign, or the Provisional IRA, excuse me, to essentially force a British withdrawal from Northern Ireland. This is what they sort of like demand, and they pursue this through a very sort of like one-sided question of like they have this very like one-sided understanding of the role of like violence and force in achieving this. But then there is firstly the sort of by 1972 this has become untenable in that the period, if you will, of insurgency is like over, and everything which follows this falls into the sort of category of terrorism. And in 72 you have this beginning of what begin to talk about the need to like think politically, to like have a strategy, and this is something which then like develops throughout the 1970s towards the emergence of people who have been there at the start, but then like move to like the forefront to like lead, being Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, who sort of move towards and are seen as this this turn towards away from like outright like blunt violence towards like politics, and towards like parity of esteem, i.e. the sort of ending of like the sort of the parity of esteem between the sort of like two like communities, which you see this like term community sort of really begins to like emerge as a sort of as like the term by which you like define the problem as like being one between like two communities. It's not about or less about the sort of like political point which underpins this, or anything else. It becomes about like the two communities, particularly as this parity of esteem also emerges from the fact that the most of the sort of discrimination is sort of actually eliminated quite early on by like the increasing sort of direct control of influence of like the British government in London, and then in 1974 with the Ulster General Strike by the Ulster Workers' Council and the UDA to collapse the sort of local sort of government set up under Home Rule, and then you have from 1974 onwards the establishment of what was called direct rule. So the 1980s see as a sort of a sort of continued like refining, or like defining, I should say, of this political strategy. This like continued like demand for parity of esteem. Particularly in the 1980s, you have this the term that often gets used is the sort of is that nationalists are like alienated from the state, and which Margaret Thatcher did not like. She thought that alienation was a Marxist term. Disliked sort of hearing it, and then you have essentially the basically the move towards through the 1980s and the 1990s towards a like negotiated like settlement, whereby you have the re-establishment of a sort of like what's then becomes called sort of like evolved administration, which is like different from, in a sense, like Home Rule, with sort of like weighted majorities, and i.e. that the two communities, this like parity of esteem, they both have to like agree to govern jointly and so on. There is a shift in like emphasis, this is under like Tony Blair, away from unionism on the part of like the British state, and the Irish state then officially like drops what are called Articles 2 and 3 of its constitution, which assert its sort of claims to Northern Ireland, and within this you have the in the 1980s, due to the partially sort of spurred on largely by like the hunger strikes, you have the re-emergence of the of Sinn Féin then as like a political party that sort of contests elections and so on. Moving away from its abstentionist sort of approach, full stop. Its argument that the states are by definition delegitimate, and the sort of politics shouldn't be engaged in. So you have like the re-emergence of Sinn Féin, who, as well as in the 1970s you have the founding of the DUP, and both of whom, as with like nationalist and unionist parties, and both then overtake the two largest parties, being the Ulster Unionist Party and the SDLP, the Social Democratic and Labour Party, in the wake of this like settlement. as the two more like extreme sort of manifestations of like the sort of communities like community like representatives. And this move towards this like shared governance. Yeah. Anyway, I think given the time, we should probably move on to questions. I mean, I think that's broad points that should hopefully sort of allow, based on what has been discussed before, to carry on without too much sort of.
Or do you want to start?
I guess like one thing that's striking is the official starting date of the Troubles being 1969. I mean, I don't know. I guess like you could kind of see like the official IRA and later the Workers' Party having a kind of this kind of inflection of like MLism, Marxism and Ireland.
Yes.
Which obviously like brings to mind the New Left.
It's just like the official IRA, like they become the Workers' Party.
Yeah, in like the 80s.
Yeah.
And they kind of do move more towards like a this kind of like national liberationist. It's like there's a kind of parallel with something like the ANC in South Africa, perhaps. But they basically shrink as well, and they become kind of a lot more marginal. But it's So I suppose just trying to like shape something out of all of that kind of historical raw material. Like, do you think? I guess like there's a question of like how we would assess the kind of trajectory of Irish politics at the time in terms of like the aftermath of the New Left, and obviously that's with everything that's bound up with like in Ireland, that's bound up with the British Left as well, right? Irish Republicanism is kind of going concern in the 70s and 80s. I don't know, just to kind of put it in the broadest possible like brushstrokes, like how can we like I guess assess these things in terms of the New Left, and is there like also in terms of like the IRA, the old IRA, especially like kind of cracking up in the 50s and 60s. I don't know. Would you say there's a certain parallel with the kind of old left to new left transition?
I mean, I suppose firstly I would say, you could say that there's like a certain parallel. I think the sort of parallels to the new left, I think, are in some ways more, at least early on, perhaps more obvious. You have this like party turn in like the 70s on like the left. People like getting serious about politics essentially, which you can see paralleled in a certain way. I think the sort of the sort of like broader like point about the new left is that in like the breakup of like the old IRA, they both sort of like move into like differing forms of like movementism, or slightly different forms. You have you have obviously this like broad like new left like anti-party sort of phenomenon in like the 60s, which they both sort of like come out of, I think. The sort of particularly the sort of like the one-sided way in which I think particularly the Provisional IRA and Sinn Féin sort of it's like I suppose I can say if you think back to like the podcast, which I have tried at least up to this point to avoid making too many like political judgments, partially because particularly when you move into like the 20th century, it's extremely unclear what making these types of judgments even means anymore. But on the podcast, like the sort of like rightward turn in like of like the Provisional IRA towards like violence, if you will, is I think a symptom of the sort of like one-sided way in which phenomena are like being understood or grasped. What sort of like by like the New Left. I think part of the problem, particularly in like Britain, is you have like the continued like proliferation of like Trotskyisms. I think I mentioned, which like fractures the sort of like perspectives that they sort of bring in a sense. I think you see the sort of, particularly in the British left, I think the way in which they orient towards like the Labour Party is one of the sort of important sort of ways in which they begin to like increasingly like understand the sort of question. I suppose there was like initially there was perhaps that perhaps that there was maybe an opportunity to like maybe like gain something from the sort of both the to gain something from like this like crisis, I suppose. It's like a broader like it's in a sense a sort of like a sort of broader manifestation of the sort of like crisis of Fordism, and there may have been like opportunities to like gain something from that, but I think the left was insufficient to sort of like even grasping the phenomenon. I think to like gain from them. I don't know. I'm sort of.
It's tricky as well though, because like for the New Left, like partyism versus anti-partyism, like what that's kind of splintering out from is like Stalinism.
Right. Exactly.
Right. And as far as I know, like that's an extremely marginal opinion in Ireland beforehand.
Well, I mean, in terms of like the broader sort of like effect on like politics, if you will. Partially, I think you have. Firstly, you would have, as I said, there's sort of like this retreat from politics in like the 1920s, and then it's sort of like its re-emergence essentially in the 60s. It becomes like very sort of bound up and much more like intertwined essentially in like the New Left, in a way that was probably not related to the left like previously. Perhaps the left wasn't related to it. So there is a sort of, because there is a sort of, like one-sided character to, a certain like one-sided movementism that they like adopt, as like even falling below the sort of, the type of, even if you think, if you think back to like, I don't know, the 1880s, say, 1870s, 1880s, you would have, even if you had like these like two sort of like related phenomenon of like, if you will, like the Fenians or the IRB, and like the Irish Parliamentary Party, they become in a one-sided sense about it becomes this like one-sided sort of struggle, like an armed struggle essentially. I don't know. Does that sort of clarify? I don't know. I'm sort of.
Yeah, I know it is tricky because there's so like little. I guess another thing is like the fact that like in the 60s, the sort of discontent with in Northern Ireland especially takes on like it's the demand for civil rights, right? And like perhaps there's a certain parallel with the US in a certain sense. But yeah, I don't know. It's just there's not that much like it's kind of like the left ends up kind of being late for the party in a sense, right? Or like late for the
like the party, did you say?
Late for like the kind of it's not like something gets missed. I
see.
know.
There is no like. Really, the sort of like you see, it's just the increasing problem of. I suppose you have like two like related problems. You have the way in which they become more like closely sort of aligned to the new left in a certain way, through both this like movementism and also through like national liberation struggle. In a sense, it's more a sort of like function, I suppose, of the retreat of the left into these like the abandoning of it, if you will, of like the sort of historical like perspective of it's like the non-identity, if you will, of like Marxism with like the party and the revolution and the working class and the masses and so on. Even with like internationalism, the sort of like the way in which the sort of new left begins to like fall below that like perspective. It begins to sort of identify more positively with these struggles in a way that perhaps wouldn't have been the case previously. So that there's a way in which, if you will, they both move like towards each other, and that sort of perhaps like obscures the sort of relationship in one sense. Either left sort of like falls below. The left isn't this like mass like movement for like socialism anymore. It's an attempt to sort of like return to like an emancipatory politics, but it sort of falls below that like goal and sort of misrecognizes its own moment in a sense. And then you have the sort of way in which this then gets bound up with like nationalism becomes sort of because they become like more positively identifiable with each other, they do sort of like merge, I suppose. I don't know if that's...
Why do you think Ireland played such an important role for British Trotskyists in the 70s, in the kind of post-New Left British Trotskyism?
I think there are like different sort of points. Firstly, I think it's the there is a way in which they do sort of see like a potential opportunity for like the crisis of the state in a certain way from which they can benefit, and they like continually attempt to like push that in different ways. There are different like perspectives on how you would like do that, but broadly they are like identifying a sort of an opportunity. But the question then is that are they really even in a position to like take advantage of it? I remember the CPGB saying to me once, they back in like the 80s they would like send over like the select works of Lenin and post them over to like people in prison or something, and that was like a major form of activity. And I was sort of remember thinking at the time, but what does that like achieve? Anyway.
And in the upcoming Platypus conference convention, the theme is going to be redeeming the 20th century. And you kind of raised this issue, which Rory touched on, of the kind of parallels between what Irish politics became on the left and kind of third world national liberation movements, which had this kind of tinge of Stalinism through kind of ML, Maoism,
right,
and also other forms of kind of Guevarism and all those kinds of things. Right. And to what extent is the can we kind of what is there anything to redeem from that kind of Irish politics in the 20th century? To what extent do you see it as being part of that kind of tragedy of the kind of the nationalism of the left in the 20th century? And what would that mean for a left today that would seek to, how would the left relate to Ireland in a way that doesn't succumb to that kind of nationalism?
firstly, I'd say it's just, in a sense, it's exceedingly unclear how you would even begin to like go about answering the question. How would like the question of Ireland relate to, how does that relate to like an international dictatorship of the proletariat? That's exceedingly unclear. In like Marx's time, there's like there are like concrete political sort of arguments being made, and sort of there is a sort of like a relationship that you can see quite easily, but you just can't see that now. So really, the sort of question is, well, how could you relate to that today? How would you like redeem the sort of this like history of the 20th century is just extremely unclear.
I mean, like part of the reason that I think I was kind of drawn to the civil rights aspect of it is that
Mm-hmm.
like in Ireland there's no I can't really think of like an equivalent of someone like Bourgeois or Max Fackman, right?
No.
And that's that kind of point in America in the 1950s and early 60s. There's kind of like from our perspective at least, there's kind of you can see it as in a sense being a kind of watershed, and it's kind of a way that you can kind of trace this history sort
Mm-hmm.
of like, and this history of like liquidations even of like previous socialist politics. That I feel like
It wasn't really a socialist politics per se, too.
yeah, right. Like and like with the last session as well. Like, it doesn't seem that like I don't know, someone like James Connolly is screaming out for redemption in the way that someone like Rosa Luxemburg is, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's tricky. I feel like perhaps the only way to really deal with it is like through the lens of the British left.
Yes.
Right. That's kind of I think that's like how perhaps that kind of how I guess like regression on the left with regard to missed potential in Ireland,
Mm-hmm.
and as well as more broadly, perhaps needs to be tracked.
I'd say that in a sense, in like even as I said, obviously there is the sort of like mass like socialist sort of like movement in Ireland like ever. If you think back to like the previous session, the relationship is very like contingent on the particular relationship to Britain and to the British politics, and to opportunities for like the British left. And so the problem is that even taking the question of Ireland through the sort of lens, say from like the 60s onwards, the lens of like the British left is in some ways quite difficult, because in a sense they become so sort of like divorced or distinct in a way that it's unclear even how you sort of would even like relate the two in a sense.
I mean, what's quite remarkable from a historical perspective is the way in which the extent to which these sectarian troubles are no longer with us.
Mm-hmm.
The extent to which the Brexit crisis in Northern Ireland is actually not prompting the manning of militias on the borders.
Mm-hmm.
And people probably aren't going to be blowing things up.
No.
Although there was a recent incident of a package mysteriously, all that kind of stuff. But
that's like it's just amateurish. I don't pay any attention.
I think if you look at what's fun, the kind of, I don't want to call it alt-right, but the kind of right populism that's kind of on the internet and has a sort of some kind of IRL presence, is like there's actually a lot of they're not really concerned about Ireland as a question
Mm-hmm.
at all. If you look at things like UKIP and then stuff that's to the right of it, they're not really. There are kind of Irish versions,
Mm-hmm. Well, UK have actually organised in Northern Ireland, but
yeah, no, but I mean even in the Republic,
yes,
there are kind of Irish versions of that type of a kind of populist anti-EU sentiment, anti-immigration, and they're actually in contact with their kind of English counterparts, many of whom are in fact Irish, and there is this weird way in which a particular type of politicisation of Ireland is like really disappearing, and in a way that could be a kind of advantage to any future left that wouldn't need to, that might not need to kind of come up against it. The question from a platypus perspective would be the issue of the ideological obstacles, right? So how the 20th century, the relationship between Ireland and the left in the 20th century poses, is a form of appearance of the ideological obstacles to building a mass socialist party, which would be necessary in Ireland and in Britain. But that actually the left is backwards looking towards neoliberalism and even further back, and that the political terrain of kind of post-neoliberalism is really going to be kind of unrecognisable in the way that the left has considered the Irish question up until now.
I feel like perhaps one like caveat to that though is that like in terms of like the troubles in the 70s and 80s, like, and like the legacy of that in terms of politics today, like Northern Ireland, like communitarian politics is alive and well. There's obviously been a crisis of it in the last couple of years, and like at Stormont and all the rest of it. But there are like more than twice as many peace wars now than there were in '98.
Twice as many
peace wars in Belfast, and like like school selection, access to public services still kind of divides along sectarian lines.
90%, I think, school selection.
Sorry,
90%, no greater than 90%.
Segregated school, denominated, yeah. So I don't know. I mean, perhaps something will change on that level, and yeah, there just seems to be like a kind of impasse. But at the same time, I suppose, like if we're talking about ideological obstacles, neoliberal communitarianism. I guess like one has to wonder, will that kind of like change in a kind of in a way that kind of gives opportunities to the left. Yeah.
I mean, I suppose I would maybe make like 2 points. I suppose. Firstly, on I think your point, Ephraim, about the sort of opportunities that it presents. In that sense, I think it's obviously just important to like bear in mind that the historical nature of the sort of question up to this point, and of course there's no in a sense guarantee that it will like continue to be prescient in a way, but also I think in terms of like dissolving like ideological obstacles, it perhaps like provides in like a negative sense, if you will like reading backwards, a sort of a lens by which you can grasp the sort of the need for the sort of type of historical sort of understanding of the crisis of bourgeois society, of capitalism, of the sort of need for the dictatorship of the proletariat, because in the way in which it relates to historically to the question of of its relationship to Britain.
I mean, I think certainly Rory's right that there is still like deep kind of sectarian divide in Northern Ireland.
Oh, of course.
But there are kind of, I guess what I was trying to emphasise is the way in which post-neoliberalism is not going to be a kind of reformation of the extremes, which is what people suggest about Northern Ireland as well as the rest of the world, but a kind of new centre, so that you'll see both, DUP leaders at GAA tournaments standing up for the Irish national anthem,
right.
And you'll see a kind of hardening of unionism in the political pact that kind of emerges in a form of kind of I don't know, like socially conservative, social democracy kind of type of thing, maybe, that will play to both, that will like perpetuate communities, right, in a certain way, but on new terrain.
I mean, you can already see that in the sort of. Firstly, it's important both in Northern Ireland and in the Republic that there isn't really a sort of like. You don't really have like the emergence of something like the AfD or it's leading more to a sort of, particularly if you take Northern Ireland as an example, a sort of consolidation of, or an accelerated sort of like an acceleration of the sort of like gobbling up of the sort of also unionists in the SDLP by DUP and Sinn Féin.
Yeah, but that precisely has meant that the DUP and Sinn Féin have had to change their positions.
Exactly.
Right, so actually the consolidation of that hard divide has meant that they've had to soften on many fronts. I mean,
Sinn Féin are in some ways the most obvious example, because typically they, for example, were quite Eurosceptic, and they sort of, this was before the referendum, they sort of like affected this, so you'll point out, they changed their policies rather like a change of doctrine in the Catholic Church, this sort of glacial pace at which it moves. They sort of moved all together. So in like 2013, they sort of like begun this process of moving towards sort of pro-European like approach, which just sort of like materialized in like out of the ether almost in like 2016. And it's happened also in terms of like abortion and so on. They sort of move in this direction towards like a sort of social libertinism, whereas the DUP sort of move towards greater like accommodation of a sort of greater like communitarianism essentially, as well as a sort of like social conservatism, but they sort of like it's like shifting in a sense, but it's like softening, but it's just a reconfiguration of the politics.
I mean, like, I sorry.
No, go on. I mean,
I take the point that, like, and I agree that it's not just, it's in terms of ideological obstacles, it's not just a question of the fact that there are sectarian divisions, because of course, like, these things are being sort of recalibrated and realigned. But we were talking about like opportunities for the left and like for a future left, and that I like that seems to be sort of really not on the cards in an immediate sense, like in terms of like whatever opportunities there might have been, and in this, and it's not just Brexit, it's sort of kind of there's a sort of longer term political crisis in Northern Ireland and globally, of course. So yeah, that's like I think that has to be borne in mind.
Yeah, it's just a sort of there doesn't appear to be a sort of like, I mean, really what you're talking about there is sort of like the crisis of neoliberalism, and there's like doesn't appear to have been, there hasn't been a sort of like left wing, but like leftist sort of the left doesn't really seem to have like gained anything from that.
I mean, like the most I've seen in terms of like people on the left is this kind of weird retrospective IRA fanboyism, and like but that's just kind of linked to. It seems like people's kind of best hope in Britain for Irish politics or people on the left is just that like the demographics will change and eventually there'll be a tipping point and then Sinn Féin will push for a referendum and there'll be a united Ireland.
Yeah.
I mean, that might
Which is
happen
how they
anyway,
approach the Scottish question as well.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah, eventually there'll be enough young people in
all the young people
Scotland.
Yeah, well, like,
the old Tories will all
like
die.
the Republicans will just all die of old age
Yeah.
and then we'll be this.
But I think that the
and that may happen, anyway. But there's no guarantee that there's anything that that you gain anything from that.
yeah no, but and there's this way of like separating the 60s IRA from like the 80s 90s IRA,
Mm-hmm.
and then like fanboying the earlier stuff, and it's this weird kind of, again, it avoids the problem of the state because it's what we're seeing like across the left, which is this attempt to put the new left and the old left back together again.
Mm-hmm.
So you get the kinds of, well, we want post-war Labour welfare state, but without the repression of Ireland, please. Like that plus like a bit of 60s radicalism to make us like feel good about it.
I actually had a momentum sort of like person say to me recently. Once they heard my accent, oh yeah, it'll be great. We'll have a united Ireland under a Corbyn government. And I was like, that's precisely it. But in that sense, the question there is the question is what is the correlation between the two.
It's another good example where what socialism means for the left is precisely they just accept the meaning of the slur from the right, and so in that respect, Corbyn is slurred as a terrorist lover and backing the IRA in the 80s
and Assad and whatever else,
and then the left just accepts that this is the kind of
the gospel truth,
something to endorse on the other side, and so it's part and parcel of that, and I'm sure the DUP are painted as these really evil people who,
they're
and so in the same
homophobic bigots,
and and it's the same way in which socialism has become popular as a kind of out of the fear of Trump and Brexit.
Mm-hmm.
That then you might see flickers of a kind of memory of Irish republicanism and a kind of left Irish nationalism out of a kind of anti post neoliberalism, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
If we're really going to hate the DUP, we might as well all become IRA fanboys.
Right.
But actually, what we're just concerned about is
getting rid
not
of
being
Theresa
a
May.
Labour government.
Yeah.
May
out. General election now.
Exactly. All right. On that note, we should wrap it up. Is that man wearing an orange face?
What man?
Oh, it's Padraig in the window.
What?
All right, I've totally lost the plot now.